The golden chandeliers cast warm light across the marble floors of the Henderson mansion, their crystal teardrops catching the last rays of sunset that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. The scent of fresh orchids from the grand foyer, mixed with the aroma of gourmet dinner preparations wafting from the kitchen. Everything was perfect, pristine, and painfully expensive. In the opulent dining room, fine china gleamed on the mahogany table that could seat 20. The silverware bore the family crest, each piece worth more than most people's monthly salary. Tonight was special. The Henderson family was celebrating another successful quarter for their tech empire, with guests arriving soon for an intimate dinner party. 8-year-old Madison Henderson sat at the table in her designer dress, her blonde curls perfectly styled, while her 10-year-old brother Ethan adjusted his miniature suit jacket with practiced superiority. They had grown up surrounded by such luxury that kindness had become a foreign concept, replaced by an ugly entitlement that their parents had unknowingly nurtured. The sound of gentle footsteps on marble announced the arrival of someone who didn't belong in this world of privilege, at least not according to the children's cruel perspective. The atmosphere was about to shift dramatically, though none of them knew it yet. Outside, luxury cars began pulling into the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the evening shadows. Important guests were arriving, business partners, wealthy friends, people who moved in the same elevated circles as the Henderson family. Tonight would be a night of celebration, but it would also become a night that would change everything. The house hummed with anticipation, servants moving efficiently through hallways, making final preparations. But beneath the surface of this perfect evening, tensions were building. The children's behavior toward one particular member of the household had been escalating for weeks, and tonight, in front of all these important guests, something was about to break. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true character of everyone in that magnificent mansion. Maria Santos stepped quietly into the dining room, her worn but clean uniform a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. At 35, she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the patches on her shoes and the careful mending visible in her clothing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her hands, calloused from years of honest work, carried a silver tray with practiced steadiness. To the Henderson children, she was invisible at best, a target at worst. They saw only a poor woman from the wrong side of town, someone hired to pick up after them and cater to their every whim. What they didn't see was the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in her gentle manner, or the stories her quiet resilience could tell. Maria had been working for the Henderson family for 8 months, sending most of her modest salary back home to support her elderly mother and younger sister's education. She endured the children's cruelty with patience that seemed endless, never complaining, never fighting back. The other staff whispered that she was too soft, too forgiving, but Maria believed that kindness could eventually touch even the hardest hearts. What no one in the Henderson household knew was that Maria Santos was far more than she appeared. Before life's circumstances had forced her into domestic work, she had been someone entirely different. The certificates hidden in her small apartment told a story of academic achievement, of a brilliant mind that had once commanded respect in very different circles. She had been Dr. Maria Santos, a child psychologist with her own practice, specializing in behavioral therapy for troubled youth. But when her husband died unexpectedly, leaving behind crushing medical debts, she had lost everything: her practice, her home, her comfortable life. Pride had prevented her from asking for help, and necessity had driven her to accept whatever work she could find. Now, as she arranged the crystal glasses with methodical precision, Maria studied the Henderson children with professional eyes. She recognized the signs. These weren't bad children, they were lost ones, neglected emotionally despite their material wealth, acting out in increasingly desperate attempts to get their parents' attention. She had seen it countless times before in her practice, but tonight felt different. Tonight there was a tension in young Ethan's shoulders, a particular malice in Madison's smile that set off alarm bells in Maria's trained mind. She had learned to read children's moods like others read weather patterns, and tonight's forecast was stormy. As she worked, Maria whispered a quiet prayer for patience and wisdom, unaware that both would be tested beyond anything she had ever experienced. The first guests hadn't yet arrived when the evening's drama began to unfold in the kitchen. Maria was arranging hors d'oeuvres on silver platters when she heard familiar voices approaching, voices that made her shoulders tense with anticipation of what was to come. "Look, it's the charity case," Ethan announced loudly as he and Madison entered the kitchen, their voices carrying the practiced cruelty that had become their trademark when addressing Maria. Madison giggled, a sound that should have been innocent, but had taken on an edge that made the other kitchen staff exchange uncomfortable glances. "Did you polish the silver with your dirty rags again?" Madison asked with false sweetness, running her finger along a perfectly clean serving spoon. "Daddy says people like you don't know how to do things properly." Maria continued her work, her movements steady despite the familiar sting of their words. "The silver is clean, Miss Madison," she replied softly, her accent adding a gentle rhythm to her English. "Is there something you need?" "Yeah." Ethan stepped closer, his 10-year-old frame puffed up with borrowed authority. "We need you to remember your place. Tonight's important. Don't embarrass our family in front of the guests." The head cook, Mrs. Patterson, shot the children a disapproving look, but they were used to getting away with such behavior. Their parents, successful but often absent, had never taught them that wealth didn't grant permission to be cruel. "I understand." Maria nodded, her voice remaining calm. She had dealt with far more challenging children in her practice, children whose behavior stemmed from pain rather than privilege. The difference was that then, she had been able to help them. Now, she could only endure. As the children left, still snickering at their perceived cleverness, Mrs. Patterson approached Maria. "You're too good to them, dear," she whispered. "Those children need someone to put them in their place." Maria smiled sadly. "They are just children, Mrs. Patterson. Hurting children, even if they don't know it." But as she returned to her preparations, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would bring challenges that would test everyone's true nature. Would you stay silent in such a situation, or would you find the courage to stand up for what's right? As evening deepened, the Henderson mansion filled with the sound of arriving guests, the gentle hum of expensive cars, the soft chime of the doorbell, the rustle of designer clothing, and the musical clink of champagne glasses. David Henderson, a distinguished man in his 40s with silver threading through his dark hair, moved through his home with the confident air of someone accustomed to success. He greeted his guests with firm handshakes and warm smiles, but those who knew him well might have noticed something different in his demeanor tonight. There was a tension around his eyes, a distraction that suggested his mind was elsewhere. He had been receiving disturbing reports from the household staff, whispered concerns about his children's behavior that he had been too busy to properly address. In the kitchen, Maria worked with quiet efficiency, preparing trays of canapés while the catering staff bustled around her. She had learned to make herself invisible during these grand events, understanding that her presence might remind the guests that their hosts employed help, something that was necessary but not discussed in polite society. But invisibility was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Ethan and Madison had been escalating their behavior throughout the week, emboldened by their parents' distraction with business matters. What had started as casual rudeness had evolved into something more sinister, deliberate attempts to humiliate Maria in front of others. "Maria," came Madison's voice from the doorway, sweet as poisoned honey. She stood there in her pristine party dress, her brother beside her wearing a smirk that belonged on someone much older and far more cruel. "Daddy wants you to serve the grown-ups now." This was unusual. Maria typically remained in the kitchen, during formal events, helping the professional servers with preparation, but staying out of sight of the guests. Her worn uniform and patched shoes weren't meant for the elegant dining room where political deals were discussed over imported wine. "Are you certain, Miss Madison?" Maria asked gently, sensing the trap being laid but unable to refuse a direct instruction from the family's children. "Oh, yes," Ethan chimed in, his eyes gleaming with anticipated mischief. "He specifically asked, for you. Said something about showing the guests what good help looks like." The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, and Maria felt a chill of premonition. She had seen this look before, in her practice, when troubled children were about to act out in ways that would damage everyone around them. But then, she had been in a position to intervene, to guide them toward better choices. Now she was simply their target. As she picked up the heavy silver tray, Maria offered a silent prayer for strength. Tonight felt different, charged with a tension that promised consequences none of them could anticipate. The dining room buzzed with sophisticated conversation as Maria entered, carrying the silver tray with its arrangement of delicate canapes. The guests, a mixture of business executives, politicians, and social elites, were deep in discussions about market trends and upcoming elections. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light, and the soft classical music created an atmosphere of refined elegance. David Henderson was in the middle of describing a recent acquisition when he noticed Maria approaching. His brow furrowed slightly. She wasn't usually part of the service staff visible to guests, and her simple uniform stood out starkly against the formal attire surrounding them. "Excuse me," interrupted a sharp voice that cut through the adult conversation like a blade. Madison stood up from her chair, her angelic face wearing an expression that made several guests shift uncomfortably. "Everyone should know what kind of people work in our house." A hush fell over the room. Ethan rose beside his sister, and together they approached Maria, who had frozen in place, the heavy tray trembling slightly in her hands. She could feel the weight of 24 pairs of eyes upon her, and her cheeks burned with anticipated humiliation. "Tell everyone where you live, Maria," Madison commanded, her voice projecting with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. "Tell them about your little apartment in the poor part of town." "Madison, what are you doing?" David's voice carried a warning, but his daughter was beyond listening. "She steals food from our kitchen," Ethan announced loudly, the lie dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "We've seen her hiding bread in her pockets. Poor people do that, don't they? They take things that aren't theirs." Maria's hands shook so violently now that the canapes began to slide on their silver tray. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, some looking scandalized, others appearing sympathetic to her obvious distress. But no one moved to stop the children's cruel performance. "That's enough," David Henderson's voice boomed across the room. But Madison wasn't finished. "Show them your shoes, Maria," she commanded with vicious glee. "Look, everyone, look at those awful patched-up shoes. Can you imagine? In our house, serving our food with those disgusting things on her feet." The tray slipped from Maria's trembling hands. Time seemed to slow as the silver platter tilted, sending the carefully arranged canapes flying through the air. The crash, when it hit the marble floor, echoed through the dining room like thunder, followed by the musical tinkle of breaking crystal as several glasses fell in the chaos, food scattered across the pristine floor. Maria dropped to her knees immediately, desperately trying to gather the mess, her face burning with shame as tears began to blur her vision. Her hands shook as she picked up pieces of broken glass, and she could feel drops of blood where the sharp edges cut her fingers. "Look at that mess," Madison shrieked with delight. "She can't do anything right. She's just a clumsy, dirty—" "Enough!" David Henderson's voice exploded through the room with such force that wine glasses trembled on the table. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, and suddenly every person in that elegant dining room was frozen in place. The children stopped mid-taunt, their mouths falling open in shock. They had never heard their father raise his voice like this, with such raw anger and disappointment that it seemed to fill every corner of the mansion. Maria remained on her knees, still frantically trying to clean up the disaster, her quiet sobs the only sound breaking the terrible silence. Blood from her cut hands was mixing with the spilled food and wine, creating dark stains on the pristine marble. "Get away from her. Now." David's words were measured, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Both of you, step back this instant." For the first time in their privileged lives, Madison and Ethan found themselves truly afraid. This wasn't the distracted, permissive father they knew. This was someone entirely different, someone whose disappointment radiated from him like heat from a forge. The guests sat frozen in their chairs, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, unsure whether to flee or stay. witnesses to a family drama that was rapidly spiraling beyond anything they had expected from their elegant evening. And kneeling on that cold marble floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her dignity, Maria Santos had no idea that everything was about to change. David Henderson moved across the dining room with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the stunned silence. When he reached Maria, who was still kneeling among the broken glass and scattered food, he did something that shocked everyone present, including his children. He knelt down beside her. "Stop," he said softly, gently taking her bleeding hands in his. "Please stop cleaning. Let me help you." Maria looked up through her tears, confusion mixing with her shame. In 8 months of working for this family, she had barely exchanged more than polite pleasantries with the master of the house. Now he was kneeling on his expensive marble floor, his designer suit at risk of being stained, his hands caring for her wounds as if she mattered. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Henderson," she whispered, her voice broken. "I'll clean everything, I'll pay. For the damages, no," he interrupted firmly, helping her to her feet with careful gentleness. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing at all." He turned to face his children, who stood frozen in place, their earlier bravado evaporating under their father's gaze. The guests watched in fascination as David Henderson, successful businessman, respected community leader, prepared to address his children in front of the most important people in their social circle. "Madison, Ethan." His voice was calm now, but underneath lay something that made both children step backward. "Do you know who this woman is?" The children exchanged confused glances. To them, Maria had never been a who. She was a what, a fixture, a convenience to be used and discarded like any other household object. "She is a human being," David continued, his words carrying to every corner of the silent room. "A woman who works 16-hour days to support her family. A woman who has never once complained about your cruelty, never once shown you anything but kindness despite how you've treated her." He moved closer to his children, and they could see something in his eyes they had never witnessed before. Not just anger, but deep, profound disappointment. "Do you know what she does with the money she earns here?" David asked, his voice growing stronger. "She sends it to pay for her sister's college education and her mother's medical care. She lives in a small apartment and patches her shoes because every penny goes to helping others." Madison's face had gone pale, while Ethan stared at the floor, no longer able to meet his father's eyes. "And do you know what she did before she came to work for us?" David's revelation was about to shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew. Dr. Maria Santos was one of the most respected child psychologists in the city. She had her own practice, her own office, her own successful life. Gasps rippled through the gathering of guests. Several people who recognized the name looked at Maria with new understanding and respect. "She lost everything when her husband died and left her with crushing medical debts," David continued, his voice breaking slightly. "She could have declared bankruptcy, could have walked away from those responsibilities. Instead, she chose to honor her husband's memory by working honest jobs to pay every penny back." He turned to address the room full of guests, many of whom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This woman has more honor in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. And my children," his voice caught with emotion, "my children have been treating her like she's worthless." The silence in the dining room was deafening. 24 of the city's most influential people sat motionless, their elegant evening transformed into something none of them would ever forget. Some stared at their plates, others watched Maria with newfound respect and shame for their own assumptions. Madison began to cry. Not the manipulative tears she had perfected for getting her way, but the genuine sobs of a child who was finally beginning to understand the weight of her actions. Ethan stood frozen, his young face cycling through emotions he had never experienced before. Shame, guilt, and something that might have been the first stirring of empathy. "Maria." David Henderson's voice was gentle now, filled with an apology that went beyond words. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Not just for the work you do, but for your patience with my family when we didn't deserve it." Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still trying to process what had just happened. For 8 months she had been invisible, a ghost moving through their beautiful house. Now suddenly she was the center of attention, her story told to a room full of strangers who had judged her without knowing anything about her life. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice steadier now. "Your children, they are not bad. They are just lost. In my practice, I saw many children like them. They act out because they need attention, because they feel disconnected from their parents." The psychological insight delivered in her soft accent carried the authority of her professional training. Several guests nodded, recognizing the expertise they had initially dismissed. "I never blamed them," Maria continued, looking directly at Madison and Ethan. "Hurt children hurt others. It's what they do when they don't know how to express their pain." David Henderson felt his throat tighten. Here was a woman who had endured months of cruelty from his children, and she was defending them, explaining their behavior with the compassion of someone who had dedicated her life to helping troubled youth. "You're a better person than I am," he whispered. And in that moment, every person in that room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just an apology, but a moment of genuine human grace that would change everyone who saw it. What happened next would be remembered by every guest present for the rest of their lives. David Henderson, one of the most powerful men in the city, walked over to his children and knelt down to their level, placing a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. "Look at me," he said softly. "Both of you. Look at me." When they raised their tear-stained faces, he continued, "I have failed you both. I've been so busy building our wealth that I forgot to teach you how to be wealthy in the things that actually matter. Kindness, respect, compassion." Madison threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing, "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Ethan stood rigid for a moment longer before his composure cracked completely. "We were so mean to her, Dad. We were awful." David held both his children close, then slowly stood and walked with them toward Maria, who watched with the trained eye of someone who understood child psychology. She could see the genuine remorse beginning to replace their earlier cruelty. "Maria," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "my children have something they need to say to you, but first I have something I need to say." He paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Would you consider coming back to work as a child psychologist? I'll pay off your remaining debts, help you reestablish your practice, and make sure you never have to compromise your dignity for financial security again." The offer hung in the air like a gift too beautiful to believe. Maria's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Henderson, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," whispered Madison, stepping forward with hesitant steps. "Please say yes. We need you. I need someone to help me understand why I was so mean and how to be better." "We both do," Ethan added, his voice small but sincere. "You're smart and kind, and we treated you terribly. But maybe you could help us learn how to be the kind of kids you'd want to work with." Maria knelt down to their level, taking both children's hands in hers. "Learning to be kind isn't hard," she said gently. "It just requires practice and the courage to choose love over fear every single day." She stood and faced David Henderson, her decision clear in her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll help rebuild my practice, and I'll start by helping your family heal." The guests began to applaud, softly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. They had witnessed something remarkable: the transformation of cruelty into compassion, pride into humility, and judgment into grace. "Now," David announced to the room, "let's properly celebrate. Tonight, we honor second chances and the courage to change." 3 months later, Dr. Maria Santos was seeing patients again in a beautiful office downtown, her practice rebuilt and thriving. But her most important clients remained Madison and Ethan Henderson, who visited her twice a week not as patients, but as students learning the art of empathy. The children had transformed dramatically. Madison now volunteered at a local shelter, reading to younger children, while Ethan spent his Saturdays helping at a food bank. They had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in possessions but in the positive impact you have on others' lives. David Henderson had also changed, making time for his children and involving himself in their emotional education. The family, that had once been divided by privilege and neglect, had become united by purpose and genuine love. The story spread through their social circle like ripples on water. Other wealthy families began examining their own relationships with their household, staff, their children's attitudes, and their own values. Maria's waiting list grew with referrals from people who recognized that money couldn't buy the most important things in life. But perhaps the most beautiful change was in Maria herself. She had discovered that sometimes our greatest setbacks are actually setups for our greatest comebacks. Her time as a nanny, as painful as it had given her insights into family dynamics that made her an even better psychologist than before. Tonight, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, how do you treat the people who serve you? Do you see the humanity in everyone you meet? Remember, true character isn't revealed in how we treat those who can help us, but in how we treat those who have nothing to offer us except their humanity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply see someone, really see them, and treat them with the dignity every human being deserves.